Hello and welcome to Lesson 4 of our Introduction to the Suite Cloud Development Framework here on SuiteHub. In the previous lesson, we looked at the typical lifecycle of an SDF project and the huge number of operations and options that SDF provides us to facilitate that lifecycle. Now, here in this lesson, we'll take those individual operations and combine them into practical processes. And hopefully, inspire you a little bit to adapt and automate these processes for your own situation. Now, as I said in that previous lesson, there are no one-size-fits-all solutions here. The processes and ideas that I present in this lesson will be practical and useful baselines, but they may not fit exactly for every developer, every team, or every situation. The lofty vision that I have for this lesson is that you start to see beyond the examples that I give. And what I hope you come away with is that having your object definitions and your deployment operations moved out of a UI and into code opens up this brand new world of possibilities for automation and adaptation to whatever your needs might be. You take the ideas and the examples that you see here, experiment with them, adapt them, and expand on them to meet your own needs. Okay, we'll bring it back down a notch and get into some actual examples. We're going to go through the processes of creating a project, of deploying a project, and then we'll discuss that question of how to organize your customizations into projects. In our lesson on the lifecycle of an SDF project, we talked about the initial steps that we typically take when creating a new customization project. First, we create the SDF project using Project Create. We establish account authorization using Account Setup. We import existing files and objects using their import commands. We update project dependencies using Project Add Dependencies. Then we ensure the project is deployable using Project Deploy. We only have to run 6 commands, and SDF accomplishes a ton of legwork on our behalf, which I am thankful I don't have to perform on my own. But maybe we're a small team that breaks our customizations out into multiple interrelated projects. Or we work for a NetSuite partner that regularly creates multiple projects for multiple clients. While it's amazing that we don't have to do all of SDF's work ourselves for every new project, the more we manually execute these 6 steps, the more we increase our risk of mistakes or inconsistencies or forgetfulness. And the harder it becomes to update these steps if we ever want to modify them. But we don't have to execute these 6 steps manually. And that's what this lesson is all about. SDF enables us to initiate these steps with code, and we're developers. We write code. So let's write some code to condense these 6 steps into one repeatable, portable step. Quickly, if you don't know or use shell scripting and what I'm about to show you looks unfamiliar, that's perfectly fine, because those aren't the parts of the lesson you need to learn or retain, and the concepts on display can be adapted to any environment you are comfortable with. What I do hope you latch onto here is the power enabled by SDF letting us write these processes in code. In my shell environment, I'm going to create a new command on my system called SCNP, for Suite Cloud New Project. I do that by creating a new file named scnp. And then I just add my 6 commands to the file, just like I would call them on the command line. And there we are. We create the project, we manage the authentication, we import files and objects, we add dependencies, and we validate. Now, there's a slight nuance here, which is to say there's a bug in my code. And I know that because I screwed it up a whole bunch of times in the past. After we create the project, we need to navigate into the project directory before we can run any of the other commands. That's a problem because we don't have the name of the project until we answer the prompt for project create. But I don't know how to read our answer out of project create into my script, nor do I know how to pass the name into interactive mode. So instead, I'm going to pass the project name into my scnp command and use the same name when I answer the prompt. So in Bash, we read input parameters with a $sign followed by a number. So $1 would be the first argument. We know the directory has the same name as the project. So after the project is created, I'm going to cd change directory into the project directory. Now, all I have to do to accomplish all 6 project creation steps is run this one scnp command. In the terminal, I'm working in the GitHub repository for the course. The link is below. And I'm going to create a new SDF project for lesson 4 using this single command we just wrote. So the command is already running project create. I'm going to choose account customization. I'm going to enter the same name here that I provided on the command line initially. And once again, for our purposes here, we're not going to use the unit testing framework. All right, the script has automatically run account setup for me. That's prompting me for my authentication, or I could create a new one. Let's use Salto's account. And now I'm automatically going to be prompted for files to import. I don't have any in this case, so I'm going to hit Control-C to skip this part. And it's going to move on to objects to import. I have one list and one client script that I would like to import. List, client script, go. I will filter for IDs containing SDF. And there is my client script and my custom list. And I do want the file associated with the script to come into the project as well. Objects is great. Overriding is fine. After it finishes importing our objects, now it's going through and adding our dependencies. And we can see we have one warning during validation. So all 6 of our steps have been accomplished in one single command. In about 30 seconds or so, we have a brand new project created, initialized with a few objects, validated, and ready to build on. Now, did this save us that much time as compared to running those commands manually? Maybe, maybe not. But we only had to remember one command, not 6. And we only had to write this script once. Now we can run it repeatedly ourselves for all of our projects. And we can share it with our teammates for them to run for all their projects. And this is only the beginning. It's a useful but a minimal example. For instance, we're not limited to SDF commands within this script. Anything we can normally do from the command line, we can do in this script. We might always instantiate a new Git repository within each project. We might always copy in our own templates for the SweetCloud config file or the deploy.xml file. Your options become nearly limitless. And this is only one script that gets executed once per project. Let's take a look now at a part of the project's lifecycle that could potentially happen multiple times a day, every day, for some projects. The process of deploying an SDF project. Deploying customizations reliably is SDF's primary reason for existence. In our lifecycle lesson, we talked about the importance of validating a project beforehand to ensure a successful deployment. The validate and deploy operations will be by far the most used and the most critical operations in every SDF project. You want to do everything you can to ensure these operations are executed correctly and consistently every time. And that can be really difficult if you try to coordinate all of that manually. It can also just be really hard to remember. Perhaps you always want to perform validation with the server option enabled. Or previously we talked about working with account-specific values. Perhaps your team always treats those account-specific value messages as warnings. Remember that SweetCloud configuration file we talked about earlier? We can use the before executing hook of an operation to modify the behavior of SDF to align with these sorts of operational decisions and defaults. We're here in our lesson 4 project that we just created. We can see the client script source file we brought in and our custom list and client script objects all here. But we are interested right now in the configuration file. First, we need to add a property for the validate operation to the commands configuration object. And we give that new object a before executing property. Before executing is a function, and it gets passed a single object parameter, which we will call options. We can manipulate the parameters of an operation during before executing by modifying the arguments object contained within the function parameter. The properties and the values inside of options.arguments have the same names and values as the corresponding option in the command line version of the operation. So to change the server option of the validate operation, we set the server property of options.arguments. Because server is a simple flag with no associated value in the command line, we set it as a Boolean here in the JavaScript. True turns the flag on, false turns the flag off. We do the same thing with account-specific values, but in the command line, account-specific values requires an associated value of either error or warning. So in the JavaScript, we set the value to the string warning. NetSuite advises that you return the options object that gets passed into before executing. Now, whenever we run the validate operation for this SDF project, it will always run with the server option enabled and the account-specific values option set to warning. Before you run off and start setting all of the default values for all of your operations, understand that setting option values in this way means that you will not be able to specify different values for those options via the command line. Options that are specified in the config file will override the options specified on the command line. So make sure you truly always want an operation to behave this way before you override its options. And the SweetCloud configuration file can also be used to switch up the directory structure of our project. If you recall, in lesson 2, we showed how to override the project directory for all operations using the default project folder configuration property. That's up here. It's already set to source, which is the default value. And we showed how to override the project directory for a specific operation using the operations project folder property. So let's use that same idea from lesson 2. And we're going to set the project directory for the deploy operation to dist. Now, why might we want to do this? Well, perhaps you prefer or need to obfuscate your code before you deploy it to an account. So you have a minification step as part of your deployment process. The full readable versions of your files would show up or would live under source, and the minifier would output the obfuscated files to dist. It's a fairly common practice. With this setup here, in this configuration, SDF will only deploy the minified files instead of the readable files. Just by setting these two properties, we have already handled this situation. What if you forget to do the minification step? Well, if you catch it right away, you can probably just run it and redeploy and no one's the wiser. But what if you don't catch it right away? Instead of relying on your memory, SDF enables you to automate that process without needing to learn yet another tool chain or build system like Webpack or something. You can use these same event hooks to import and run any JavaScript code, whether it's code you write or third-party code. So long as it runs in a Node environment, you can run it in your SweetCloud configuration file. Perhaps you run your code through a linter like ESLint, which you should definitely do. Or perhaps you unit test your code, which you should definitely do. And perhaps you have a large monolithic SDF project that takes 20 minutes to deploy. So you want to send Slack notifications when the deployment either succeeds or fails. Let's see how that might look. Now, whenever you run the deploy operation in this project, your linter, your unit tests, and your minifier will automatically execute before the deployment. If any of those steps fail and throw an exception, the deployment will never even start. I'm of course making up these fake modules as stand-ins because there is an endless amount of options out there for these features. I could never cover them all, and everyone watching this would have differing opinions and preferences. But don't let the pseudocode take away from the central idea here. You are here in this course, presumably because you write SweetScript, which makes you a JavaScript developer. And SDF allows you to automate your SweetScript operations by using JavaScript. All right, let's step away from the code now for a little while because I want to revisit something I said just a little bit ago. I mentioned that you might have a large SDF project that takes 20 minutes to deploy. That was not an exaggeration. Small, simple SDF projects will validate and deploy in a few seconds. If you choose to keep all of your customizations in one project, then as the project grows over time, those operations will start to take longer. longer and longer. The more objects and files you add to a project, the sooner you'll start measuring deployment and validate times in minutes instead of in seconds. And that's one of the biggest drawbacks of using a large monolithic structure. So let's talk about that choice we talked about a long time ago, whether to use a single monolithic SDF project for all of your customizations, or to break your customizations down into multiple interrelated SDF projects. Right up front, I will tell you there's no right answer. Both approaches are viable for most situations. So let's look at the benefits and the drawbacks that I see for each one, and hopefully that will help you make informed decisions when it's your turn. A monolithic project is simple. It puts all of your customizations in one place. There's never any guesswork about where any one object or file lives. It's all in the same project. You can contrast that with multiple SDF projects. You're going to need to track, mentally or otherwise, which projects own which objects, which customizations. Deployment of a monolith is also really simple. You navigate to the project, run through your deployment process one time, and you're done. With multiple SDF projects, you might have to navigate to several projects and run through the deployment process multiple times. You'll also need to make sure you're deploying the projects in the correct order so that any dependencies resolve correctly. And you also can't run the deployments in parallel if there are any of those dependencies. You must wait for each one to complete before starting the next one. With enough projects in flight, you might need to build some sort of automation to coordinate all of this correctly. And because you're using SDF, you can totally do that. While the overall process of deploying many separate projects might get complex, the validation and deployment of any single project will be significantly faster than deploying a monolith because the individual projects are much smaller. It's very unlikely you'll need to deploy all your projects every time, and you only need to deploy the projects which you've actually changed. So that time savings continues growing quickly over time when you compare it to deploying the monolith at the same frequency. The smaller size of an individual project also means that the project itself is more focused. It contains less cognitive overhead. If you're working on the sales order approval project, you're only going to see objects and files and code relevant to this sales order approval project. You don't have to worry about other customizations, other files, other code cluttering up either your mental or your digital workspace. Organizing with multiple projects also forces you to make a conscious choice about where something should live. It forces you to consider separation of concerns for your projects and design them appropriately. It prevents any one project from becoming the dumping ground for customizations that don't have a better home. In a monolith, these dumping grounds can appear, as you can just lump all the files into one folder or all the code into one file without much thought. And over time, that can compound and result in a very, very messy project that is unwieldy to maintain. So with all of these differing factors in mind, let's see where I see each of these approaches fitting well. Monolithic projects work really well for a single NetSuite account with a relatively low number of customizations. They also work exceedingly well for Suite apps, which are generally designed to be self contained. Although a Suite app can have dependencies on other Suite apps and other objects, and thus it could be broken up into multiple projects, that might present some really impractical challenges when it comes to distributing and organizing those different Suite apps. Monoliths, even large ones, are also appropriate when you deploy infrequently. If you're not deploying very often, the pain of long deployment times is less potent. And the complexity that comes with deploying multiple projects infrequently probably isn't worth it. Multiple projects, on the other hand, work really well for a single NetSuite account with a vast number of customizations. Breaking down your business solutions into smaller, focused projects gives you lean projects with low cognitive overhead and fast deploy times. Due to that lightweight nature, multiple projects also work well for customizations that see frequent updates and deployments. If you're deploying daily or multiple times a day, you don't want to wait 20 minutes for every deployment cycle. Smaller projects will validate and deploy faster and are unlikely to change in tandem. If you are a NetSuite partner that works with multiple clients across many accounts, multiple projects are definitely a good fit. In fact, I'll even go so far as to say in this situation, you cannot use a monolith. Do not combine customizations for multiple clients into one SDF project. You will inevitably deploy the wrong objects to the wrong client's account, and it will be a giant mess to clean up. Separate your client's customizations, please. Lastly, there's something of a hybrid approach you can take here. The primary pain point of monoliths is the time that it takes to deploy a large project, which you will end up with in a monolith. The primary reason deploying a large project can take so long is something we talked about way back in the core concepts lesson. SDF only deploys the files that have changed, but it always deploys every object in the project, regardless of whether it has changed. The number of objects you're deploying will most directly affect the duration of validation and deployment. And one way to mitigate this problem is to modify the deploy.xml file during every deployment so that it only lists the objects that have changed instead of the entire objects folder. This works, but it can be quite tedious and risky to do manually, as any of the objects that you remove from deploy.xml now probably need to be added to the manifest as dependencies. It's something you can potentially automate, especially if you're using Git or another version control system, but even that gets incredibly difficult to manage if the objects in your projects might also be changed from the UI. This introduces a major shortcoming of SDF, where SDF does not possess any conflict resolution or conflict detection for changes in an object between a project and its target account. It will blindly overwrite whatever files or objects you either update, pulling down into your project, or deploy, pushing up to the account. This dramatically increases the risk of unintentionally overwriting someone else's changes. I call this problem environmental drift, and it's a huge deficiency in SDF, a very risky problem, and we will talk about it in the next lesson when we talk about shortcomings of SDF. Okay, getting back on track with the hybrid approach. Another way to mitigate the long-running deployment problem is to remove or separate the most time-consuming objects from the project. In my experience, workflows and custom forms hold that honor. They are very large, very complex objects to deploy. Workflows and custom forms also tend to be fairly isolated in that they change rather independently from any other customization type, aside from workflow action scripts, which are very tightly coupled to workflows. If you do have a large project that takes ages to validate and deploy, you can consider separating the custom forms, the workflows, and workflow action scripts into their own project and leaving the rest of your customizations in the original project. You would then use the manifest.xml file in both projects to coordinate any dependencies between the two, just like you would if you were using several smaller projects. This separation will be especially impactful if your workflows or forms don't change very often, because you won't need to validate or deploy that separate project often. And your much smaller, leaner, more frequently deployed project with the rest of your customizations in it will validate and deploy much, much faster. Okay, that was a lot of information, but it's critically important information that highlights the power of SDF. Take your time, digest the information, play with the examples, experiment with them, and start dreaming up new ones. Up to this point in the course, we have learned many of the individual features of SDF, and we've organized them into practical workflows for accomplishing day-to-day development tasks. And hopefully we've inspired you with a few ideas or dreams about what you might be able to do and build with SDF as the foundation. In the next lesson, we'll come back down to earth just a little bit as we talk about some of the shortcomings of SDF, where you should expect to come up with your own fixes or alternatives and processes that SDF just will not provide. As always, be sure to visit the course Slack channel with any questions or answers that you might have for myself or your fellow students. Thank you once again for being here. I'll catch you in the next lesson.